In your book, Democracy at Work, you lay out a very compelling argument for what you refer to there as workers' self-directed enterprises. And I have a few questions about that concept. It's intriguing. First is, so let's say we begin to move in that direction in America. Let's say there's an auto manufacturer that is effectively a worker self-directed enterprise. And one of the benefits you mention is that it's unlikely that workers are going to vote to ship their jobs overseas, right? But if that worker self-directed enterprise is competing on a global marketplace with other auto manufacturers that are shipping jobs overseas and producing therefore far less expensive cars, won't the end outcome be essentially the same, that those workers will have lost their jobs either way, either because they can't compete in the global marketplace or because their jobs have been outsourced?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to answer that. One is theoretically, and the other one is with a concrete, real-life example. So let me do a little of both. First, theoretically, if there were no difference between the two corporations, the capitalist one on the one hand and the worker self-directed enterprise, the worker co-op on the other, then yes, your example would be fine. If one has an access to cheaper labor and the other one doesn't, then the one with access will win the competition. But they're not the same, and therein lies the crucial difference. When workers are their own bosses, something which, by the way, most American workers would tell you, at least at the level of fantasy, is something they dearly love and want, even though they can't get it. But if workers were their own bosses, I think it's reasonable to expect that they would have a very different attitude toward the company. The employer then is not an other person. The employer is not a person against whom you have resentments about what power he wields, what money he earns, what he takes from you in your own view, etc. And the reason is because the employer isn't somebody else. The employer is you. You wear both hats. You're in a co-op. You're both the worker who does the work, but also the boss who makes the decisions and gives the orders. You're an order giver as well as an order taker. I think the old rule would apply. If you have more skin in the game, if you have more of a vested interest in the outcome because you're on the board of directors as well as an employee, you're going to work harder, you're going to work better. You're going to be looking out for how the company can be improved much more than if you are a simple worker in a capitalist enterprise and you're fearful, and by good reason, that any improvement you make will give higher profits to the boss, but you'll see very little of it in your paycheck. So I think that co-ops have chances to outcompete capitalist enterprises, so that a co-op confronted, for example, in your example, by a competitor who moves to another country to get lower wages would say to itself, well, that's not a decision we're going to make because we're a co-op. We're not abandoning our community. We're not abandoning our families. We're not losing our jobs. So we will have to find other ways to economize and to make cheaper, better cars, because that way that company has chosen is not acceptable to us. And let me give you then an example of what such a company could do. It could, for example, go around the country and say to American people, look, you have a choice, you Americans, you fellow citizens. You can save $500 and get that car that was made over there in a capitalist enterprise in China or India or wherever. And if you do that, you will be supporting a company that closed its factories here, producing disaster for the lives of the workers who lost, producing disaster for the community that no longer had the business or the tax incomes that it used to have when the cars were made here. And by the way, cars is a great example because nothing is starker as a proof of what I'm saying than looking at the wasteland we call Detroit, Michigan, where all of this actually happened. So I would argue that the co-op would go around the country and say, look, you do have a choice. you can buy our product. Maybe it isn't as cheap as the other one, although we're achieving economies of other sorts that make us pretty close. But you can choose not only on the basis of price. If you look at Detroit and you say, I don't want to see that happen again in the United States, then you'll buy a car from us and not from them, even though it costs you $100 or $200 more, because that's a way you can contribute to building a country that is founded on people doing work and committed to the communities in which they live and are not traipsing after the almighty dollar by running around the world, leaving in their wake the kinds of disasters you see in Detroit or Cleveland or 100 other cities in the United States. I think that would be a powerful, competitive struggle that the co-op might very well win. I could give you other theoretical examples, but let me give you a concrete one. Probably the most successful and well-known worker co-op in the world today is a remarkable story of how and where and when co-ops not only functioned well, but outcompeted the capitalist enterprises struggling with them in the market. This is the story of something called the Mondragon, Mondragon, the Mondragon Corporation. It was begun in 1956, so a little over half a century ago, in the Basque region in the north of Spain. It was started by a Roman Catholic priest working and doing his job in that part of the country. It was a poor part of the country, no jobs, high unemployment. And basically the priest, Father Arizmendi was his name, said to his parishioners, look, if we wait for a capitalist to find his or her way into this area, set up a business, and hire us so that we have jobs, we will probably die of old age before that happens. So I think what we ought to do is get together, you as working people, I as your priest, and to set up a workers' co-op. Don't wait for someone to employ you, employ yourself. And so he did, starting with 6 workers in the little town of Mondragon, Spain, in the north of Spain. This Catholic priest and 6 parishioners set up the first co-op. Now fast forward to 2014. It's called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. It now currently employs over 100,000 people. It has grown spectacularly across this half century. It is now the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. And in this corporation, the workers decide what happens. The workers together direct their own enterprise. The workers hire the managers, not the other way around. Among the rules that govern the Mondragon Corporation, one that I think will tell you more than anything else, the rule is the highest paid official cannot earn more than 8 times the lowest paid official. In the United States, the normal range in large corporations is that the CEO, the highest paid official, earns around 300 to 350 times what the lowest paid person does, just to give you one idea. This corporation is so successful that it has developed its own bank, it has developed its own retirement association, and it has developed its own research laboratories where it does advanced research to help all of the member co-ops. By the way, about 200, 250 co-ops that are part of this collective of co-ops. The research labs help them, and so successful is the research that is funded by this co-op that there are 2 well-known American corporations who pay Mondragon money every month to allow their scientists to work over there in Spain in their laboratories because the research being done there is so important for the future of these 2 American corporations, whom I will now name for you, General Motors and Microsoft. So here's a company that proved, not in an abstract theoretical argument that I offer you, but in the actual world of daily business competition, that a cooperatively organized enterprise whose first priority is to provide good and secure jobs to people, jobs in which they are not only order takers, but also order givers, self-directed cooperative enterprises. Mondragon proves that they can compete very well, often outcompeting capitalist enterprises, and display a story of growth and success that most capitalist corporations would be, and for good reason, are envious of.
So, are there other examples of such successful worker self-directed enterprises that begin to approach the level of success of Mondragon? And if there aren't, does that weaken the argument for the example that it sets?
To my knowledge, there is nothing quite like Mondragon, which is why it shows up so often once you get interested in this topic.
Mm-hmm.
But there are loads and loads, thousands and thousands of worker co-ops across the world. Country by country, they vary. In some countries, particularly because of government help, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, there are many of them. Italy, for example. Italy has probably got more co-ops per person than any other country in Europe. Last year, the government of Wales, the Welsh part of the United Kingdom, created a commission to foster the development of a worker cooperative sector in the Welsh economy, making the argument that because of the difficulties of capitalism, it was no longer reasonable for the people of Wales to have their economic well-being and futures dependent on an economic system, namely capitalism, and they use that word, that hasn't delivered the goods for their people, and that therefore prudence dictates that they also develop the worker co-op sector in the hope that a combined society will do better than relying only on capitalism. I will say that you're correct, that if you simply counted up enterprises, that a much larger number of co-ops are small compared to the numbers that are large. But of course, and here I put my hat on as an economist, exactly the same thing is true of capitalism. The number of small capitalist enterprises, I'm talking about enterprises with 50 or fewer workers, is much larger than the number of huge corporations with the names we're familiar with. That's part of how capitalism works. I would also draw your attention to the fact that when one system, economic system, begins to fade and another one begins to emerge and grow, the early phases of that process always show that the new kind of enterprise starts as a small enterprise. That, for example, is true of capitalism. When capitalism emerges in Western Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, emerging out of the pre-existing system there called feudalism, let me underscore that, all of the early capitalist enterprises were small. A capitalist was a family and had 10 workers, 5 workers, 15 workers, etc. It took a long time for the small initial capitalist enterprises to become larger, to discover how to grow, how to handle the new problems that come to any business as it grows. And exactly the same thing, I believe, has happened and will continue to happen with cooperative businesses. The first ones, the early ones, are predominantly small, and then they have to struggle, particularly when they're successful, and they are able to grow. They have to struggle and solve the problems of growth. The importance of Mondragon is to show that it has been successfully navigated, the transition to growth and to largeness, and so I'm quite confident that they will be able to do that in ways like the Mondragon and in new ways that they will discover as capitalism is more and more in difficulty and as the interest in worker co-op as an alternative grows.
One thing I'm curious about as well is that for example, in 1965, manufacturing jobs accounted for 53% of the economy. Presently, it's about 9%, as you likely know. Is that enough of a base from which we could begin to alter the economic system, particularly if worker self-directed enterprises are primarily manufacturing enterprises, or am I wrong in thinking that?
Yeah, the last point, that's not correct. That is, as I survey it, worker self-directed enterprises are actually more common in what we call services than in manufacturing. They're common in both, and in some countries it tilts one way or the other. But when you look at the picture as a whole, there really is no reason to assume that worker self-directed enterprises are going to be more likely to develop and grow among factories as opposed to offices or stores or any of the different ways of producing goods and services in an economy. Give you an example. Here in the United States, a bakery, a coffee shop bakery in the Bay Area in California began 20, 30 years ago. And they called themselves the Arizmendi Bakeries. And an awful lot of people didn't know the history of Mondragon. Otherwise, they would have recognized, of course, what they were doing. A bakery choosing the name of an obscure Roman Catholic priest in Spain, but it was obviously their choice to signal what they were trying to do. Well, they've been very successful. There are now 5 Arizmendi bakeries in the Bay Area of California, which are kind of grouped together in one corporate heading, like Mondragon, and they show that they have been able to produce what is largely a service enterprise, because they really do more of the way of serving meals and serving coffee and serving pastries than they are the producers. It's a little bit of a mixed enterprise. But they've navigated this perfectly well, grown very successfully, and they represent a very nice story here in the United States, of which, and there are many others in the United States, but it's a very nice story of the ability of these enterprises to work, whether it's services or manufacturing.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Now, former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, as I'm sure you're aware, he seems to be fairly strongly advocating simply a more regulated form of capitalism, something bringing us closer to what we had during the New Deal to combat inequality, but also to maintain the capitalist system. Why is that not a tenable solution to the problems of capitalism?
Yeah, I think there the issue is really one, again, of history. It is understandable to me that in the Great Depression of the 1930s, when capitalism, which had been touted as this great system that produced progress and prosperity by its very nature, et cetera, when this had collapsed so badly, when the unemployment rate in 1933 was 25%, official rate of the U.S. government at that time, it was understandable to me that there would be a drive to say, okay, this capitalist system we have is clearly broken, so let's try to fix it. And so they fixed it. They created the Social Security system in the depths of the Depression. They created the unemployment compensation system. They passed a minimum wage for the first time. And they had a vast program of government employment, of the federal government creating and filling jobs by the millions. And those were attempts to fix capitalism. But this kind of fixing didn't solve the problem, because all of those regulations, all of those innovative new programs, all of those tax regimes, the very things that Robert Reich proposes to do again, all of those proved to be inadequate to what each and every one of those programs promised. And that promise was not only to get the United States out of the Great Depression of the 1930s, but, and now I quote you, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt at the time, I quote, to make sure that neither our children nor our grandchildren are ever subjected to this kind of economic breakdown again. Well, the regulations, the taxes, all of the reforms that Robert Reich wants us to do again, that we did then, failed to deliver on that promise. They have not protected the children or grandchildren from another crisis. We're in the middle of one now, and it's a doozy. And if you actually look up the economic record, you will discover that between the end of the Great Depression, usually dated around 1941, and the onset of the current so-called Great Recession in 2007, we had 11, count them, 11 major or minor economic downturns. This is a capitalism that is fundamentally unstable and whose instability has not been eradicated, overcome, suppressed, whatever word you want, by all the regulations. And here we are, 75 years after the terrible Great Depression, in what we half seriously called the Great Recession, which is now in its 7th year. And it seems to me that those who wanted to use the technique of regulations, of the New Deal, they've had their chance. They got us the New Deal regulations, but they didn't succeed. Not only that, they left in place those boards of directors and those major shareholders who have spent the last 30 or 40 years systematically undoing the very rules and regulations that Robert Reich is pointing to. So my counter to him would be, A, we ought to try something different because those rules and regulations didn't have the effect that was promised and that we want. And number two, the capitalism you want to preserve, this organization of enterprises with boards of directors and major shareholders in their undemocratic power position, they're the ones who we know can and will undo whatever regulations we actually might be able to pass. And I think the majority of American working people, they kind of know this. And if you tell them you should go out in the streets and fight real hard for another bunch of regulations and rules, they're going to look at you and say, we've been there, we've done that. That doesn't do the job. We are again in a major economic crisis. We are again worried not only for ourselves, but for what it will mean to our children and grandchildren. We can already see what it's doing to the first generation in American history of college students who are racking up debts that will cripple their financial lives for the rest of their lives in order to get a degree which means less than it ever did, and will get them a job that will pay less than they'll need to get out from under the debt. This is a sign of a society whose economic system is not functioning, and therefore I think another rule, another regulation is too little and it's too late, and that we need much more fundamental change. And the way I see it, if we could change the organization of enterprises, if we could democratize the enterprises so that the workers themselves make the decisions, we're going to get a lot different kinds of decisions that are going to be much better for the mass of people than the decisions made by major shareholders and top executives, which have been and continue to be good for them, but no longer good for the rest of us.